Order. Statement. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and Minister for the Cabinet Office. Minister David Lidington.
Mr. Speaker, sir, on February the 8th this year, I announced the appointment of Sir Brian Langstaff to chair the Infected Blood Inquiry. From the outset, Sir Brian has been clear that he's determined to put people at the heart of the inquiry and to ensure an inclusive and transparent process. He and his team conducted a public consultation on the proposed terms of reference for the inquiry, which ran from the 2nd of March to the 26th of April. They invited contributions via an online questionnaire, by email, written correspondence and telephone. The inquiry team also held 15 meetings with groups and individuals across the UK, something that Sir Brian is keen for the inquiry to continue to do as it moves forward. The inquiry received almost 700 responses to its consultation, and Sir Brian, having reflected on the consultation responses, wrote to me on the 7th of June to advise me of the outcome and his recommendations for the terms of reference. The terms of reference are comprehensive and reflect the key points made during the consultation. The geographical scope of the inquiry is United Kingdom-wide, looking at issues relating to the whole of the UK as well as regionally. Sir Brian expects the inquiry team to hold regular meetings across the UK, and so I have consulted, as I am required to do under the Inquiries Act 2005, with the devolved administrations of Scotland and Wales, and in the absence of a Northern Ireland executive, with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who in turn consulted the Permanent Secretary of the Northern Ireland Department of Health. The governments of Scotland and of Wales, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, were content with Sir Brian's recommendations, and I am happy to accept his recommendations without amendment. I have written to Sir Brian to confirm this. The terms of reference have been published and deposited in the libraries of both houses today. The inquiry can now formally begin its work and will start today, the 2nd of July 2018. Sir Brian proposes to use groups of experts to assist the inquiry. Those groups would cover all the material fields relevant to the inquiry. Their evidence would be public, transparent and subject to scrutiny. People affected and other participants to the inquiry will be able to propose experts and to put forward questions to the expert groups. During the inquiry's public consultation, views were expressed both for and against the appointment of additional panel members. Some, noting the complex and difficult issues to be examined by the inquiry, wanted a panel of many experts to assist the chair. It is Sir Brian's view that his proposal for expert groups will achieve the objectives of those who have been in favour of panel members by providing legitimacy and transparency, a diverse range of expertise and, importantly, speed. Sir Brian's view is that experts will be able to progress work in parallel in a way that co-determining panel members could not, and that, very importantly, everything the expert groups will do will be public. Sir Brian plans now to discuss this proposed approach with those who will most centrally participate in the inquiry, particularly survivors and groups representing them, and ask them whether, in the light of the proposed approach, there remains any significant wish for him to be joined by a decision-making panel. Sir Brian has asked me to defer a decision now on panel members until core participants have been appointed and have had the opportunity to consider the proposed approach. And I'm aware that when my right honourable friend, the member for Ashford, met many of those affected before Christmas last year, there were then many who supported the idea of the chair sitting alongside other panel members, and I have not lost sight of this. But I think it's only right that I allow Sir Brian time to consult core participants, and I therefore do not propose to appoint other panel members at this time, but will consider the issue once core participants have had an opportunity to look at Sir Brian's proposed approach. Section 7 of the Inquiries Act 2005 of course, allows me to make further appointments to the inquiry panel during the course of the inquiry with the consent of the Chair. Speed is of the essence, and I have asked Sir Brian to report back to me as quickly as possible, and I will then make my decision on panel members. Many thousands of people from across the United Kingdom have been affected by this terrible tragedy, and sadly a number of people affected have died since the inquiry was announced. One of the clearest messages from the inquiry's consultation was the need for speed. In his letter to me, Sir Brian noted that one respondent to the consultation had said, "I really hope this inquiry does not drag on, as I would like to live long enough to see the result." So it's extremely important that the infected blood inquiry can complete its work as quickly as a thorough examination of the facts allows, and this is something that Sir Brian and his team are very aware of. This inquiry is a priority for the government, and I have assured Sir Brian that the Cabinet Office will provide all the resources and support that the inquiry needs to meet the demanding timescales that are essential in order to meet the expectations of the people affected by this tragedy, who have already waited so long for answers. The inquiry will have much to do over the coming months, and I'm sure will waste no time in getting started. The first stages of the inquiry will be critical in obtaining evidence, including witness statements from people who have been infected and affected. The inquiry will use this evidence to help uncover what happened and why. It will hold its preliminary hearings in September at Church House, London, where core participants will be able to set out their priorities for the inquiry. My exchange of correspondence with Sir Brian and the full terms of reference have been placed in the libraries of both houses, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his statement and for giving me advance sight of it. Today's statement is a sign of progress, but it is also an indicator of how delayed this whole process has been. It is a year since the inquiry was announced and 6 months since the responsibility was rightly transferred to the Cabinet Office, and yet we're only now getting details of its sittings and terms of reference. The unpleasant and inconvenient truth is that the longer the delays, the longer the grass into which this matter has been kicked, the fewer victims will be around to see justice. And the Set Just State referred to the testimony of one survivor in his statement. Taken together with other inquiries such as Grenfell Tower, where the government had to chop and change the format numerous times in response to public dissatisfaction, there is an overall impression given that when it comes to public inquiries on public safety or government malfeasance, this government has wanted to give away as little as possible, as late as possible. Nevertheless, today is progress, and we welcome the statement and the new terms of reference and the start of the inquiry. From looking at what happened at the outset, to the response from government, the treatment of its victims and their families, the question of whether evidence was deliberately destroyed and a possible cover-up mounted, and whether individuals or institutions are to be held responsible. Those terms of reference have been welcomed by those affected, their families and the campaigners supporting them. Can I also welcome the Minister's recognition in his statement, the Secretary of State's recognition in his statement, that speed is of the essence following on from the previous delays. We also welcome that the inquiry is to be UK-wide, which will overcome the anomaly of previous inquiries or compensation schemes which were dependent on the jurisdiction in which the original contamination took place. We hope that now the inquiry can crack on with its work. Can I ask the Minister to confirm that the inquiry will be given the finance it needs to follow the evidence and complete its inquiries unhindered or unrestrained by lack of resources? The responsibility in government for sponsoring this inquiry was transferred to the Cabinet Office because the Department of Health was at best conflicted or at worst possibly implicated, albeit perhaps historically. Will the Minister confirm that a clear instruction has gone out or will go out from Downing Street that full cooperation is expected from ministers and officials at the Department of Health? And can I ask if any mechanisms have been put in place to support the inquiry in monitoring the Department of Health's cooperation in this matter? We welcome that Sir Brian Langstaff will have expert working groups set up to advise him. There is a feeling from some campaigners that the Penrose inquiry in Scotland suffered from having Lord Penrose sitting on his own, and we note that Sir Brian will make a recommendation to the Secretary of State on additional panel members after consulting the core participants. There had previously been a doubt about legal aid being provided to the victims and their families for the earlier consultation. Can the Secretary of State confirm that support will be available for those participating in the inquiry itself, both financial and, where necessary, counselling support? Will the Minister confirm that any claims to commercial confidentiality made by the firms involved or their modern-day successors will not take precedence over the need of the inquiry to get to the truth on behalf of the victims? This inquiry now passes into the independent control of Sir Brian. However, can the Minister indicate if there will be a mechanism for interim reports to be given to this House and so to those affected and their families? Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, would the Secretary of State join me in paying tribute to the courage, the resilience and the determination of the surviving affected people and their families to have stayed in this fight for so long? And would he also join me in paying tribute to honourable members from right across the House in the APPG for contaminated blood, and especially my honourable friend, the member for Hull North, for her leadership to keep this matter in the attention of ministers and the whole House?
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I first of all welcome the honourable gentleman's support for the inquiry and for the direction of travel that I've announced today, and I'm very happy to join him, particularly in paying tribute to the courage and tenacity of the survivors and the organisations that work with them, and also to pay tribute to the Honourable Lady and to my honourable friend, the member for West Worthing, who have worked together in a compelling demonstration of cross-party unity and determination to secure justice for the survivors here. I think that in terms of the time, I do want to emphasise to the House that the government has consistently tried to move this inquiry ahead as quickly as possible. It was right, I think, that we reflected the criticisms that had been made of the initial idea that it should be sponsored by the Department of Health and that responsibility was switched to the Cabinet Office. It was important to get a judge who's had the right experience and expertise to take on this task, but who also was both willing to take it on and could free him or herself for up to 2 years full-time in order to chair this inquiry, and finding the right judge with the willingness and ability to commit time is not something that is always straightforward. But Sir Brian, I think, has wasted no time, and even ahead of his retirement from active duty on the bench, which his retirement taking place in May this year, he took initial steps to understand the brief, and since his retirement from the bench he has been very active in ensuring that he talks directly to survivors groups and others, and there's no doubt in my mind that he is absolutely committed to both getting to the truth and securing justice, but also to doing so in as speedy a way as possible, given the need to ensure proper examination of evidence. If I can touch on the particular questions that the honourable gentleman, member for Chester, raised. On finance, yes, the Cabinet Office will provide Sir Brian and the inquiry team with all the resources that they need to do their job effectively. Second, the Prime Minister has made it clear that the Department of Health, the National Health Service and all branches of government should cooperate fully with Sir Brian and the inquiry. While it is for the NHS in the devolved areas to take decisions in the light of the devolved government's views, I want to make it clear I have no reason to expect anything other than full cooperation, and I know that the governments in both Scotland and Wales are also very determined to ensure that there is justice, openness and the delivery of the truth for survivors at the end of the day. The honourable gentleman asked me about whether measures will be taken to monitor the Department of Health. I think if there were to be, and I do not expect this, the slightest suggestion of a failure to cooperate, I can assure him that the necessary instructions would be given. The Prime Minister's view on this has been absolutely clear. He asked me about legal aid, and I can confirm that we are making legal aid available. We have first of all said that people can claim for the costs of legal representation during the consultation, and under Section 44 of the Inquiries Act, I am allowed to determine the power of the Chair to make awards for legal funding. I have decided that given the exceptional nature and gravity of the infected blood tragedy, it is overwhelmingly in the public interest that applicants are provided such funding by the government. And I could add that those applicants will not be subject to means testing. The honourable gentleman asked me about the Penrose inquiry. One of the problems with the Penrose inquiry that the Scottish campaign groups drew Sir Brian's attention to was that Penrose was assisted as chair by a single medical assessor. Sir Brian's proposal now is for panels of experts representing different areas of expertise that need to be brought to bear in our search for the truth, and his proposal is that that is the best way, commensurate with the speed required, to ensure that the survivors get to the truth as rapidly as possible.
Philip Hollowbone.
His department's central working assumption about how long this inquiry will take and how much it will cost?
These are matters ultimately for the chair of the inquiry, because this inquiry is independent of government direction once it has been established. Our working assumption is that it may take up to 2 years, but I don't want in any way to prejudge the decisions that Sir Brian will come to or where the evidence will take the inquiry.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The infection of patients with hepatitis C and HIV from contaminated blood products is actually the worst tragedy and scandal in the 70-year history of the NHS, by the number of people infected, the ignoring of the evidence and the cover-ups that we hope light will be brought to bear. It is, as the Chancellor said, almost a year since the inquiry was announced, and during that time, sadly, 90 people have died in England, Scotland and Wales, who will therefore not get the answers they had hoped for. As he mentioned, speed is of the essence. So what steps are the government taking to avoiding this ending up entangled in a Maxwellisation process at the end, as happened into the inquiry into the Iraq War? What financial support will be available not just for legal counsel, which I'm sure is very welcome, but to actually help victims and their families attend the inquiry? I understand it will move around the UK, but it will still have costs to families who struggle. Obviously, one of the other limitations of the Penrose inquiry held in Scotland is that they were unable to force witnesses from the Department of Health to attend that inquiry, even though this scandal happened when the Department of Health was responsible for healthcare right across the UK. The Chancellor mentioned those who still work for government, but what about those who don't? Will this inquiry be able to summon and force witnesses to give evidence? Because if this inquiry doesn't finally get to the bottom of both what happened, the decisions that were made, and the cover-up that may have happened afterwards, then people will be very bitter.
Hear, hear.
To thank the honourable lady for her support, and she's right that there have been many allegations that there have been not just an appalling degree of misjudgment and mistreatment of people, but then a subsequent cover-up. And one of the specific terms of reference involves asking the inquiry to consider whether such concealment took place, who would have been responsible for such concealment and the extent of such concealment. So that is very much something that Sir Brian and his team will be looking into. I mean, one of the problems about appointing co-determining assessors would be that almost inevitably it would slow down the speed at which the inquiry could progress, because we would need to find experts. There'd be a question about how many experts in order to cover the field, but who were then prepared to take off a year or 2 years full time in order to serve alongside the chair. And that was one of the reasons I know that weighed heavily in Sir Brian's mind when he made his proposals about the terms of reference. In terms of powers to summon people, yes, an inquiry of this kind under the 2005 Act gives the inquiry the power to compel the attendance of individuals.
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Speaker. In accepting Sir Brian's view about the work of expert groups, can we be assured that those expert groups, the expert panels, will be fully transparent? Everything will be publicly available to those with an interest?
Yes. Sir Brian, in his letter to me, proposed that there should be expert groups covering a number of areas of expertise. Those would range from clinical expertise, that group itself needing to involve experts in haematology, hepatology and virology, but then separate expert groups dealing with medical ethics, with statistics, with the psychosocial impact of the infected blood scandal, and experts on public administration. It is certainly Sir Brian's intention that the deliberative sessions of those expert groups should be undertaken in public, that the core participants in the inquiry should both be able to propose to the chair names for appointment to those expert groups, and should also be able to ask questions of the experts during their deliberative sessions, as well as during formal evidence given by the expert groups to the inquiry in plenary session. Now, clearly our expectation would be, and the way these inquiries would normally operate, is that that intervention on behalf of survivors and other core participants would be via their legal representatives, and that again reinforces the reasons why the government has agreed exceptionally to offer legal aid.
Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Minister for making this oral statement today. The scandal is on a scale that we know over 2,500 people have already died as a result of this disaster. Far greater than if you add up all the other disasters from the 1970s, starting with the Moorgate tube disaster, running right through to Grenfell just last year. So more than all of those added up together. And I want to pay tribute to all those who fought long, over many years, to get to this point. Those who were infected and those who were affected. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I wonder if you would pass on my thanks to the Speaker for assisting Parliament in getting to this stage today by granting, I think, 7 urgent questions in recent years, many debates and questions and statements, which has led to us today with these terms of reference. The terms of reference, I think, are comprehensive and cover many, if not all, of the points that those infected and affected have raised with Sir Brian. Could I just ask the Minister whether he's made mention of 2 years as a possible timescale for this inquiry? Does he think that that is a realistic timescale, considering that Penrose took far longer than that? And is there a mechanism by which Parliament can be given reports on a 6-monthly basis of the progress that's being made?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would join the Honourable Lady in the tribute she's paid to the campaigners. The 2 years is an estimate, and it's very difficult to be more precise than that, because so much depends upon where the evidence leads Sir Brian and the inquiry team. The fact that the expert panels he's proposed will be able to carry out their work in parallel with the inquiry proper I think will make it easier to progress at speed than was the case under Penrose, where the medical expert sat as a co-determining member of the inquiry alongside Penrose himself. I should have said in answer to the Honourable Lady on behalf of the SNP, I'm happy to say to the Honourable Lady and of Hull West is that the inquiry will be able to offer interim reports. While I cannot promise reports to the House at particular intervals, because again the inquiry is independent of government direction, the possibility of interim reports is something that I have emphasised to Sir Brian lies within his powers.
Stephen Kerr.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I welcome the statement from my right honourable friend? And can I also say how important it is for my constituents and the families of those who have been impacted by this, that the inquiry is conducted in a speedy fashion, with answers and conclusions available as soon as possible. Can I ask my right honourable friend to confirm that the lessons learned through the experience in the Scottish inquiry will be fully taken on board by Sir Brian?
Yes, I can give that assurance, and indeed, when Sir Brian was consulting survivors groups and campaigners prior to sending me his proposed terms of reference, he took note, amongst other groups, of what the Scottish Haemophiliac Society and the Scottish Infected Blood Forum both said about what had gone wrong in respect of the Penrose model, and Sir Brian is very keen to avoid those problems occurring in this new inquiry now.
Frank Field.
On behalf of those families who have been devastated in Birkenhead by death, and those who may face a similar fate, may I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his statement today. When the Prime Minister established the Hillsborough disaster inquiry, she broke the rules so that truth would emerge. She ruled, or got the whole government to agree, that it was on the onus of government to produce all the relevant papers, and that the inquiry wouldn't have to go fishing in the hope of finding those papers. Would the Right Honourable Gentleman please give the same undertaking for this inquiry?
I will happily give the Right Honourable Gentleman that undertaking. What is more, I know that my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, is utterly determined that my cabinet and my other cabinet colleagues are very determined that we should get to the truth over this. It is important that the truth comes out, both and most importantly to provide justice and transparency for the survivors and for their families, but also so that any lessons about public administration can be learned and applied, so that we never have to go through, or our constituents never have to go through such an experience again.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. On behalf of my constituents who have been inflicted by this most horrendous of situations, can I welcome the update that the Secretary of State has given? And can I ask, with regard to the ability of these impacted constituents to be able to propose experts and put forward questions to expert groups, how that opportunity can be cascaded so that nobody misses out?
Well, it will be for the Chair and his team to set out exactly how they plan to run the inquiry and how the expert groups, once appointed, will operate. But I think Sir Brian has demonstrated already his commitment to engage closely with survivors and with campaign groups, and I know that he will be very determined to ensure that nobody does inadvertently miss out of the opportunity to pose whatever questions they wish.
Alistair Carmichael.
On the question of additional panel members to sit alongside the chairman, the views of Sir Brian are obviously going to be very important, must be taken fully into account, but ultimately it will be the Minister's decision, and it is a decision that will have a very profound impact on the job to be done. Expert advisors will give expert advice, but it will be the chairman and or the panel members who ultimately make the recommendations. So as the Minister decides whether or not to appoint extra panel members, can he assure me that the views of all those who have campaigned so long and so hard to get to this point will be taken into full account?
I can definitely give the right honourable gentleman that assurance, and I shall be taking particular account when Sir Brian reports back to me, in I hope a few weeks' time, of the views that have been expressed by campaigners and survivors groups in response to the proposals that he has tabled.
Eddie Hughes.
Deputy Speaker, a number of members have commented on the importance of concluding this inquiry quickly, but could my right honourable friend update us on the work that the chairman of the inquiry has already done in preparing for the future stages?
Well, what Sir Brian has done is to carry out a number of meetings with groups and with individuals across the country. He and his team have conducted, public consultation online, inviting letters, emails, telephone calls. So I think he has demonstrated his commitment to take this forward rapidly and to do so taking very careful account of the views of survivors in particular. When I've met Sir Brian, it was very clear to me that his involvement in the Bristol Royal Infirmary public inquiry of a few years ago had made a huge impression on him, and I know that he wants to apply the lessons that were learned in that inquiry to deliver the very best possible inquiry into the infected blood scandal.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I ask a question about the role of third sector groups in relation specifically to the Haemophiliac Society, to have reassurances from the Minister that within the overall inquiry that survivors will be able to make their own representations independently of third sector groups such as the Haemophiliac Society, not in any way to detract from their work, but simply that some individuals may not have always had a 100% positive relationship with those groups, and that they can be considered completely separately. Their representations can be taken completely separately from those of the society or other third sector groups. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
I mean, one of the things that Sir Brian Langstaff had said to me in his letter proposing terms of reference is that different groups had different views on how the inquiry should best be approached, and he will want to make sure that everybody gets their fair say. Obviously, it is for the inquiry, not for ministers to determine who should be accepted as core participants.
Mike Wood.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can my right honourable friend confirm that as well as direct legal expenses, that related legal expenses in relation to responding to the consultation on the terms of reference will be met so that the voice of victims and their families can be properly heard?
Yes, all reasonable expenses for legal representation to respond to the consultation on the terms of reference will be met. Any individual claims will be handled by the solicitor to the inquiry.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Obviously, when this debate is, when this issue is raised, I always thank my constituent Cathy Young, leading member of the Scottish Infected Blood Forum, who lost her husband to contaminated blood. Can I just ask the Secretary of State? I've had constituents who were involved in the Chilcot inquiry. And the Chilcot inquiry had waited years due to maximalisation. It comes back to the question that my honourable friend from Central Ayrshire asked. Can we make sure that someone who is being asked to be held into account, or someone who is at fault for any reason, will not unnecessarily delay the outcome of this inquiry due to maximalisation?
I think that it is in no one's interests that this inquiry is delayed unnecessarily. It should take only as long as is required to establish the truth and come to appropriate conclusions. I believe that Sir Brian has the powers that he needs in order to take forward an inquiry that is both thorough and speedy, and I very much trust him and his team to do that. He, as much as anybody else, is conscious of the agony that survivors and their families have already had to endure. He will not want this inquiry to last one day longer than is essential.
Stephen Kinnett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Farrugia family in my Aberavon constituency have been treated in an absolutely appalling manner throughout this entire sorry affair, so they will certainly welcome the announcement today. But could the Secretary of State provide a bit more assurance about the access to the updates, regular and detailed updates, I hope, that my constituents will receive as this process begins and goes on? Thank you.
Well, the question of whether there'll be formal interim reports is a matter for the inquiry chair under the terms of the 2005 Act. But I can assure the honourable gentleman, through him, the Farrugia family, that all proceedings of the inquiry and all proceedings of the expert groups will be public, and I'm sure that Sir Brian will want to ensure that the records of those proceedings are made widely available to all who are particularly affected.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I also thank the Minister for a very fulsome reply that he's given to all of us here in the House, and on behalf of my constituents and indeed across all of Northern Ireland, as a Member of Parliament from Northern Ireland, what plans does the Government have to improve the financial support for people infected by contaminated blood and by blood products and their families? And what discussions has the Minister had with the Northern Ireland Health Department in the absence of a non-functioning Northern Ireland Assembly?
Well, clearly it is for the Health Service in Northern Ireland to improve procedures, and I think the Health Service has sought to do throughout the United Kingdom in the light of what is already known about the contaminated blood scandal. But I think one of the advantages both of having proceedings of the inquiry in public, including those of expert panels, and of having the possibility of interim reports, is that would enable the Health Service in Northern Ireland and elsewhere to make whatever additional changes might be needed in the light of the inquiry's emerging findings.